The problem with mandatory minimums. Senator Laura E. BKE Thursday, March 9, 2017. Today, Wednesday, March 8, the legislature advanced an amended version of LB 447, a bill which would eliminate some mandatory minimum sentences. The World Herald story on this can be found here. I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned about the so-called mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums really came into popularity in the late 80s and early 90s. They originated as part of the war on drugs. Prior to that, the criminal code typically, as they still do with most violations, had sentencing guidelines, or a range of time which the judge could sentence the convicted criminal, taking into account the facts of the case, mitigating, extenuating, or aggravating circumstances, which would allow the judge to sentence, depending on the circumstances, at the low end or high end of the sentencing range. Nebraska's 1C and 1D felonies, which LB 447 deals with, currently have a mandatory minimum of 3, in 1DS, or 5, in 1CS, with a maximum of 50 years. As you can see, judges have a lot of range with which to consider unusual circumstances and grant some leniency, or throw the book at someone. The problem with these mandatory minimums is this: they're mandatory. To be clear, no one is saying that any of the crimes covered in felony 1C and 1D categories are things that anyone should be doing. Some of those crimes are quite despicable, although generally not violent. Drug distribution and manufacture, some sex crimes, some firearms possession crimes, etc. are among those in these categories. And with a range in sentencing from 3 to 50 years, judges have the ability to put people away for many years if circumstances warrant. The problem is on the lower end. If a 19-year-old, who has never been in trouble before, gets caught up with a circle of friends who use him to help distribute illicit drugs to a circle of regular buyers, and he gets caught with 10 grams of cocaine, about 1/3 of an ounce, under current statute, his crime is chargeable as a 1D felony, with a mandatory minimum of 3 years in prison. The judge can't take into consideration mitigating circumstances like previous record, family background, financial circumstances, work record. The judge cannot give him less than 3 years. The judge can sentence him to the mandatory minimum of 3 years, and he will spend 3 years in prison. Without a mandatory minimum, under current statute, the judge can still sentence him to 3 years, but his parole eligibility date, PED, would be at about 18 months if he had received the necessary programming, behaved himself while in prison, etc. The parole board would meet, and if he had met the necessary requirements, could be released on parole, under supervision for the remainder of his term. This differs significantly from the problem you could have, under the same set of circumstances, with a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years. The convicted individual knows, going in, that if his sentence is 3 years, he has no chance to get out early, and one might argue that his incentive to behave, or cooperate in programming, is diminished. When he hits 3 years, he jams out. The Department of Corrections/State, no longer have any claim on him. No post-release supervision, no accountability via parole reporting. He just gets out. The justice reinvestment efforts that the legislature has been a part of over the last 3 or 4 years recognizes that the vast majority of people in prison today will eventually get out. The question is, what will they be like when they get out? Will they have rehabilitated? Will they be supervised when they're released so that they have the best opportunity of succeeding? Or will they return to their earlier offenses, and end up back in the system? If we are to fix our corrections issues, we must take a global look at what we're doing, and how we're doing it. We need to avoid reflexively saying lock 'em up, throw away the key. It doesn't work that way. We can lock them up, but most of them will be coming into society again. We need to prepare those who are incarcerated so that they have the best chance possible of not returning. We need to look at the causes of crime, we need to think about how best to address different types of crime, and we need to have a little bit of patience. Mandatory minimums are useful largely for prosecutors so that they can avoid having to actually try a case they reused as clubs as the prosecutor works with defendants and their attorneys. They allow the prosecutor to say we've got enough to charge you with a 1D drug felony, which will get you a mandatory minimum of 3 years, no parole, if you are convicted, but if you plead guilty to a felony 3A, and you might even get probation. I understand the desire of prosecutors to do that. But the question is, does it really keep us safer? Does it increase or decrease recidivism? Does it violate the liberty interests of individuals who might not really be guilty, or might be able to prove themselves not guilty at trial, but who so fear extended time in prison that they plead to a lesser charge? Should the state be required to prove its case when taking the liberty of someone? I co-sponsored the original LB 447 because I have serious concerns about mandatory minimum sentencing. I believe that with 50 years as the top end for these crimes, judges have it within their power to throw the book at the truly awful out there, and that they should be able to exercise some leniency if circumstances warrant. Some have argued, what about judges who are just soft on crime? First, it's not clear that this is a thing in Nebraska, but if it were, prosecutors have the ability to appeal sentences which they believe are too lenient for the crime. After 2 days of debate, a compromise was reached. Senator Lou Ann Linehan introduced an amendment, which became the bill, limiting the removal of mandatory minimum sentences in 1C/1D felonies to only the drug convictions. The amendment was approved, and the bill was ultimately advanced from general file to select file, where we will have more debate. I think this compromise amendment was a reasonable start. States around the country, as well as the feds, are rethinking earlier mandatory minimum designations.